Today's question is, what spiritual teachings have had the biggest impact on my life and why? Dude, that's hard. I'm just going to list some, and I'm not even going to call them the most important. It's very possible with all the teachings that I've encountered that, even the most important one is not going to make it in this video just because I'm not going to sit and write this down. I'm just going to list some that I can think of off the top of my head that were particularly important to me. The one that was particularly important to everybody at one point or another, I think, The Power of Now. The Power of Now. That's what got me started. That's honestly the book that got me started. And it feels like such a cliche to say that. I remember hearing, there's a joke in this play called Matt and Ben, where J.D. Salinger says, let me guess, you read Catcher in the Rye when you were 14 and thought that book was written specifically for you. You finally felt heard, yada, yada, yes, I've heard it before. I'm like, well, yeah, I mean, that was me. It's making fun of the fact that that's literally every guy's experience with reading The Catcher in the Rye when they're a kid. But yeah, I think everybody who read The Power of Now had a really hard time not thinking about that book for 2 weeks. And tried really, really hard to be present in a way that was, they quickly came to face with the fact that being present is not very easy and that it is more of a lifelong practice than it probably seems when you read that book. I do have some issues with Eckhart's writing, and I think given some other things that I've read, it's not really a great how-to guide for enlightenment, but it does propose the idea of what if you were present all the time? And I think that in itself is so valuable. Even if I don't think it's the most important book I ever read, it was the one that got me started, and it's one that's extremely accessible, and sometimes that's more important. It's like I don't know, it's like how Bill Nye, his show will not teach you the most valuable scientific insights, but it will get you excited to start learning about science that will get you to those ones, Power of Now, I think, is a great entryway. There's a guy named Jed McKenna that... holy heck, if you read Spiritual Enlightenment, The Damnedest Thing, which is his first book, I want to give so many warnings to people about before they read that book. I'm just going to tell you, you will probably be depressed when you read it. You're probably going to be depressed, and it will probably linger with you for long after you read it. But in a way that... really tests you, which I think is really valuable, and it has some fabulous insights in it that really cut right to the core of spirituality and ignores a lot of the flowery nonsense. Now, I like me some good flowery spiritual jargon, right? I like that stuff. Even when I'm this isn't really advancing me to listen to it, it at least gets me in the practice of things. It's I can have the fun spirituality, and Jed McKenna is not the fun spirituality. Even though he is very funny, he's a fantastic writer, and that's a pseudonym, by the way. I think the internet has figured out what his real name is, but it's not Jed McKenna. It cuts. That is painful spirituality. I could give a whole lot of recommendations for blissful spirituality books. The Power of Now, one of them, especially if you've never read one before. And I could give some painful spiritual texts. That's just how I'll write it. Jed McKenna is a painful spiritual writer, and he's painful because he is real. Even though Jed McKenna is not real, you know what I mean. The stuff that he says is real. And you learn that you survive that kind of stuff. You learn that you survive tough reality. And then there's a guy named Peter Ralston. He wrote a book called The Book of Not Knowing, which I have to admit that I only found it because it was on actualized lists of recommended spirituality texts. It's his number one. He says it's the most important book on enlightenment. And I would say, yeah, probably if you can only ever read one book, and it's not an easy to read book, and it's not a particular, if Power of Now makes you feel great, and Jed McKenna's stuff, Spiritual Enlightenment, The Damnedest Thing, makes you feel terrible, The Book of Not Knowing is just very scientific and probably kind of dry the first time that you read it. But also very insightful. I mean, you will walk away with a lot of valuable insights, and I definitely recommend reading it more than once. I have the audiobook that I've been playing a lot this year. And it's just amazing. It's just amazing. And you hear stuff that he says and you're like, yes, yes. And you say yes, yes, yes more times the more times that you read or listen to it. It's a really, he just so plainly breaks down what the self is, what the ego is, all the so-called knowing that we are doing all the time, all the beliefs that we build up. And I can't do him justice by even trying to summarize it. I would just say read that book. And I watch interviews with him, and he's a cuckoo bird, man. He's a very interesting human. I mean, I believe from reading his stuff that he is a spiritually enlightened master. Of course, I don't know. That's the thing about any spiritual text that you read is that you don't actually know if the person's enlightened or not. Because that's part of spirituality, is realizing all the things you don't know. I don't know that he's enlightened, but I'd say he makes a good case for himself being. But yeah, he's a wild, kooky character. A very articulate, smart, deeply insightful, kooky character. So those are just 3 that I'll say today. But man, I could geek out and tell you all different kinds.